a lot of this has been you have a great idea and you move forward with it, and then you realize all the things that probably would have stopped you from doing it had you known that in advance, and one by one you just sort them out and get better at it, and then a few years later you're like, I'm so glad I did that. But there's that moment in between where you're like, well, what am I doing?
Speaking of which, I remember having a rather interesting conversation with you many a year ago when you told me that you would never, and you said never, put your beer in cans. And I can remember the day I saw your beer in cans, sending you an email saying, what is going on? But there's an interesting story behind that.
Yeah, well, and it's a good lesson for me to never say never and never say always. The world of beer has changed a lot in the 12 years since we opened. And, when we opened, beer in a can was beer that you didn't care about. For me, at least.
Yes.
If you were willing to put your beer in a can, it meant you did not care about the beer. And for us, it was all about making our beer special.
Yep.
And what we've found over time, a couple things have happened. One is the technology around canning has improved. So
that's what I was trying to tell you all those years ago.
Right, but at that time it had improved, but it was still shitty. Now it's gotten to the point where arguably it's as good and can be better. Again, it's there's a lot of nuances, and it usually comes down to who's operating it and who manufactured it. But you can't make the argument anymore that beer in glass is always better.
Well, it's like a cork versus screw cap with wine. Yeah,
similar argument. What we started finding though was a lot of the work that we do is all impact driven, and we're trying to have the biggest impact that we can on the world, and trying to really elevate the human spirit. And in a lot of that work, it ends up being donating to festivals and events that have charitable motives behind them. And those festivals started coming to us saying, sorry, we don't want to work with you anymore because bottles are too hard to work with and draft is too hard to work with. We only want to work with a brewery that can supply us with cans. And we did all of our best work to explain that it's far more economical to be in draft, but when it comes down to it, the person that's running the festival is usually mostly concerned with how easy is this for me to make sure that I can do this piece, because for most festivals, beer is not the most important thing in the festival.
We're talking about music or arts or food festivals here, right?
All of those, and then a lot of charitable fundraisers as well.
Right.
Ones that sort of the main reason for the festival is to raise money for a charity. But yeah, like all of the music festivals, a lot of festivals just basically said we don't want to deal with draft anymore because it's complicated.
Yep.
It's economical, which was always our argument, but it's more complicated. Things can go wrong. And we had to admit that we were losing that argument. And we also started expanding where we sent our beer. And when you are selling beer in Ontario, there's a really good bottle return program. When you're selling beer in Quebec, there's a really good bottle return program. When you sell your beer further than that, there is no bottle return program. So your bottles will get recycled, which is great, but they're heavier. It costs more carbon to ship them there. Yep. And there's a lot of carbon in recycling them. That's where selling in a can really starts to make more sense, because your carbon footprint really starts to go down. I would say within sort of our home markets of Ontario and Quebec, glass is, from a carbon and from a sustainability perspective, far superior, because both those provinces have great bottle return programs, and rewashed glass is so much better than recycled aluminum. But that's for us, that was another very important part. But the thing that we've also come to understand is that at the end of the day, we exist to make our customers happy. And if our customers no longer want our beer in a bottle and we refuse to give them what they want, we're kind of the asshole in the situation. Yeah. So we've had to say, you know what, we've got our values and we've got our principles. Now that we can be assured that we can put beer in a can and have the quality meet our vision for our beer, holding off on the can thing was really something that was more ego driven than it was customer driven. And so we've had to kind of suck up our pride and say, let's do what's best for our customers. I'm very glad to say that bottles are still 30% of our sales, and 30% is kegs and 30% is cans. So
it's a nice split. Yeah.
It's great. And one of the things that
what's the other 10%?
That's a good point. The other 10% is probably the other 3% that I'm ignoring. I should have said a third and a third and a third, but clearly I'm not a mathemologist here.
Finally, Steve, what's on the horizon for Beau's? What new exciting projects do you have?
Well, we've got a lot of new and exciting projects. I think one of the funnest ones is we're going to be launching our own podcast in the next couple weeks. So similar to the way where Oktoberfest is trying to distill everything that is special about Beau's, we're creating our own podcast to have conversations with cool people doing cool things in other parts of the world and other industries, putting in some beer education, putting in some beer culture, but really focusing on what's near and dear to us, which is good beer, good music, good food, and living life to its fullest. And so we're going to be launching that in the next couple of weeks, and I think that'll be sort of just a great way for us to tell a bigger story, because one of the things that we find is we're so busy doing cool things and doing things that we think will have an impact that most people never hear about it, and most people never really get to know the story behind why we made this beer. And when you dig into the story, it's like, oh, well, you worked with this charity to create it, and they foraged the berries, and it created employment for this group. It's really hard to tell that story on a little label that's this big. So having the ability to kind of tell the story in a longer format just seems like a very, very cool way to do it without it seeming, hopefully, like just a bunch of shitty advertising.
We'll look forward to hearing that. I think we were supposed to be recording one today.
Yeah, I don't know if we ran out of time because we've been drinking all afternoon, but hopefully we can do one.
Steve, thank you very much for joining us at Good Food Revolution, and thank you very much for your continued support of Good Food Revolution.
Thanks, Jamie.
Bye for now.
Malcolm in the background. Thank you.